So my disclaimer, of course, is that I am not an egg producer. I don't work for the industry, but I've worked very intensively with the industry since about 1999, when the United Egg Producers first decided that they wanted to write animal welfare standards to apply throughout the membership of the United Egg Producers. So I'm a little bit of an outsider, but I'm coming from the perspective of someone who conducts research on laying hen welfare and who has also worked quite a bit with the industry. So believing that you can't know too much about your future unless you know where you came from in the past, what I want to do first is talk about the U.S. and international egg industry, a little bit about the history, how it's developed the way it is, the current environment in which the industry finds itself, and some of the, what I think are pretty innovative, proactive responses that both the industry and the retailers have taken to the current challenges, and then what I see the challenges are affecting their near-term future. So to put the industry in some perspective, eggs are a major source of protein, animal protein globally. The U.S. and the international egg industry have a global production of 64 metric tons in 2010, and the United States is the third largest egg producer behind China and the European Union, 15. So we are major players in egg production. Now, if you look at the 9 of the 10, I don't have statistics for the 10th, but 9 of the 10 largest non-EU egg-producing countries, this is China, the United States, India, Japan, Mexico, Russia, Brazil, and the Ukraine. What I really want to show you about this slide, this is information collected by the International Egg Commission in 2011, is that the vast majority of production comes from conventional cage, what we call battery cage system of production in all of these countries. So in the United States, it's about 95 to 98% coming from conventional cages currently. Now, why conventional cages? Well, conventional cages were developed in the 1930s. They started coming into widespread use in the industry in the 1950s. And there were some very good reasons for the use of these cages. Prior to this time, the hens were outdoors or they were kept in barns. Putting hens in cages improved the cleanliness and quality of the eggs, as well as the ease of collecting them. It also improved hen health, particularly by reducing the access of hens to their own manure, and therefore soil-borne illnesses like coccidiosis. And ultimately, that reduced hen mortality. They also allowed improved environmental control, and without a doubt, they were more economically efficient, mainly by increasing the stocking density. And as Mark just noted in his presentation, this also, over time, greatly decreased the environmental footprint of egg production by about 25%. So there were lots of advantages, both from an egg quality perspective and a hen health perspective and an environmental perspective to moving towards conventional cages for production. However, things are changing. Public sentiments about the way animals are raised is changing. And I thought this was a very interesting article that came out recently in the New York Times talking about different kinds of hen production systems. As you'll see, the number of eggs up here are the percentage that are produced in different systems. 97% of eggs produced, notice the wording, from hens that live in tightly packed battery cages with no way to roam outside. 2% of U.S. eggs are from cage-free hens which live exclusively indoors in barns, and 1% from free-range hens. But what's doubly interesting is what they actually focus on in talking about these production systems. How much space the hens are given. How do we know that producers are complying with the standards that have been set? And what's the cost of the eggs? And I think that really sort of nicely highlights some of the issues that consumers have nowadays about freedom of animals to move around, how we know who's monitoring these systems, and what the ultimate cost is to them. And this really reflects this growing public interest we've been talking about all day in the way their food is produced, and this growing concern about welfare, animal welfare, in this case the welfare of hens, focusing on conventional cages, and with those concerns really focusing on restriction of behavior, restriction of space for free movement, and also perching, foraging, and nesting for hens. And we'll see how that's played out in the way production systems have developed. So concerns about this really can be traced back to the European Union. In 1986, the European Union decided that they would adopt animal welfare standards for conventional cages. And they focused first on things like feeder space, minimum feeder space, floor space, drinker space, etc. And they refined those standards in 1998 based on some very nice research that was done in Sweden by Ranier Tausen, looking just at configurations of cages. But by 1999, Europe decided to ban conventional cages, with the ban to take effect in 2012. But when they made that decision, they indicated that they would reconsider it in 2008 based on research on pathological, zootechnical, physiological, and ethological, that is behavioral aspects, health and environmental impacts, and socioeconomic impacts. That was a very sort of noble thing to say, although as things went along, it became pretty obvious by 2008 that they weren't really going to reconsider the ban, because by then public sentiment was such that there was no question that battery cages were going to be banned in the European Union. So let me talk a little bit about what some of the alternatives were that developed in Europe during that time, alternatives to conventional cages. The first main kind of system is what we would call cage-free housing. This is one example of a cage-free system. This is an aviary. It's called an aviary because the hens can move through multiple levels in the system. As you can see, they have perches. You can't really see them, but there are feeders and drinkers on each of these levels, and there are nest boxes inside. And it's quite common in these systems to have the ability to close the hens at night in this portion of the system so that they lay their eggs in there instead of laying their eggs on the floor. So sometimes when you walk into these houses, it looks like you're looking at cages, but it's just the hens shut in the system. Some countries no longer allow the hens to be shut up that way, but most of these systems have that ability. And then down here on the floor, you have some kind of litter, rice hulls, wood shavings, etc., that the hens use for foraging, pecking, and dust bathing. And a typical aviary system or cage-free housing system would have 30 to 50,000 hens in it. This one happens to be a divided system, so you can have smaller group sizes, a couple of thousand in here, and then you lock a door between the next section of the aviary. This is a system that's a hybrid between a conventional cage. So I didn't mention, for any of you who haven't seen a conventional cage, it typically holds 5 to 7 hens, and it's just a bare cage with a sloped floor, so the eggs roll forward for automatic collection, and it has a belt under it for manure collection, usually. Sometimes the manure drops into a pit. This is called a furnished or enriched cage. It's a larger cage. It houses from 20 to 100 hens. It is taller, and Temple mentioned that the hens can stand upright and move back and forth in this cage because it's also stocked at a lower density than a conventional cage. The hens have perches, a nest box, and this strange area that's meant to be the equivalent of a litter area. In this case, it's just an astroturf mat, and feed is often delivered onto this, so the hens will be attracted to it in order to peck and scratch. And the other kind of system is called free range or pasture-based. This is a free range system. They're very, very variable. Most free range systems are a cage-free system with pop holes on the side so the hens can go out. But what they go out into is incredibly variable. But you can also have a fully pasture-based system where the hens live outside most of the time and have some very rudimentary shelter to go into at night. They may be closed up at night. So if we look at what happened in Europe, had happened in Europe, even by 2011, the year before the cage ban was to come into effect, the European Union had largely moved away from conventional cages. Very small sliver by 2011 of conventional cage production, mainly to aviary or barn type systems, free-ranged, and a significant proportion in these enriched colony systems. So even before the ban came into effect, we saw this great diversity of systems that the producers there had moved to. What I find interesting is even if you look at other non-EU countries that are not subject to the EU legislation, we're starting to see the systems switch over. So Switzerland has almost entirely free-range production now. And that was driven by consumer preferences and some legislation. And even in Australia and New Zealand now, there's a large movement to free-range production systems, driven by consumers, direct consumers of eggs, and also retailers. So what's happening in the United States? Well, we now have, and I feel like I'm giving the swine talk again, because it's the same kind of situation. We now have a group of states where either by direct legislative action or by voter referendums or by agreements, conventional cages are essentially outlawed. And some of these are really big egg producing states, like California. And I'm a Californian. It really got started in California, of course, where else, right? In 2008, by a ballot initiative, Proposition 2, it passed by 70%, nearly 70%. And what Proposition 2 said was that all farm animals had to be given sufficient space to be able to stand up, turn around, lie down, and stretch their limbs. That essentially banned conventional cages for laying hens. So this is kind of sweeping across the United States via ballot initiative, state legislation. What was very concerning for the egg industry is that the language differed in every single state. And it looked like we were going to have no basis for having any kind of national standard for laying hen production. The egg industry tried, if any of you want to ask about this, I can talk about it. I only want to mention they actually tried to get federal legislation to provide a level playing field for all their producers that would have banned battery cages. That legislation did not pass. But it's pretty obvious that this has some national resonance because someone at Michigan State did a survey and the language that was on the ballot in California would have passed by more than 60% in every state in the United States if it had been on the ballot. Okay, so we now have a situation where we have most of our hens housed in conventional cages, but there's a big change afoot. We have many stakeholders concerned with the way their food is produced, but we have pretty much a single issue driver, and that's animal welfare. Lack of any kind of comprehensive framework for thinking about the issue. And this led the American Egg Board, and this is where I said I think the egg industry has been very proactive. In 2008, the American Egg Board gave a group of us funding to conduct a study on what it meant for an egg production system to be socially sustainable, and what did we know about social sustainability of egg production. Because sustainability, Mark showed a slide like this, is not just about animal welfare. It's about a lot of other things. It's about cost, food safety, environmental issues, impacts on local communities, human health, and public attitudes. And we have many stakeholders with conflicting values. So the American Egg Board asked UC Davis and Michigan State University to bring together teams of experts to do a literature review to find out what we did and did not know about each of these sustainability areas. And we brought together about 40 people and produced some technical papers and research priorities. And these were published in Poultry Science in 2011, if any of you would like to take a look at them. The bottom line, as of 2008, when Proposition 2 passed in California, was that when we looked through the literature, most of it came from Europe. We knew a huge amount about hen welfare in different production systems, largely as a function of this lay well project that was funded in Europe. We knew a lot about consumer values, but really only for the European Union. We really had no idea, and I think still have no idea, what the public response in the United States is to these issues. Rather shockingly, we knew nothing about the food safety implication. Europe had just funded 2 projects to look at egg safety, but there were no results yet. Environmental impacts, there was only 1 study. Economics, we had a feeling for what the cost increases might be, but we didn't know anything about US, nor did we know anything about these new enriched cages and what those costs were. And an area that's of concern to everyone in our group, the health and safety of the people working in these systems, we knew absolutely nothing. There have been no studies at all of worker health and safety. To give you sort of an overview of where we felt we were in 2008, some of you may have seen these kind of charts before. This is the stoplight chart with green, if you will, being best, yellow being intermediate, red being worst, and gray being we have no idea. If we looked at hen welfare and health, basically health, biological function, was best in cages, whereas there were more health problems for the hens in these non-cage and free-range systems. But the conventional cages were also the system in which behavior was most heavily restricted, followed by furnished cages. Hen comfort was about equivalent in all the systems because any system can have thermal comfort issues, etc. Food safety, as I said, we knew nothing about microbiological contamination, salmonella and eggs from these different systems, but we knew that there was a higher potential for chemical contamination of eggs laid on the floor or on the range. I'll skip down and talk about environment. We could make some assumptions that systems that required more space and more inputs were probably going to have higher environmental impacts, but we didn't really have data. And again, just knowing general characteristics of the systems, we could assume that these non-cage and free-range systems would have higher cost. Public attitudes are really interesting, and I think this was mentioned earlier today. We have cage-free eggs in the United States. People just don't buy them. Only 2% of the public buys them. But boy, when they get to the ballot box, do they vote for them, right? So you can assume that people's purchasing behavior is going to reflect their behavior as voters. And I think we sometimes have that assumption. Well, if the public wanted it, they'd buy it. Not always. Sometimes they vote it. So that's a lesson for all of us. As I said, we developed some research priorities. That project led to a pretty unique project that I won't talk a lot about in detail right now, but we really felt that there was a lack of whole system studies in the United States and a lack of constructive public and political discourse about what was going to happen with egg production. We actually held a stakeholder session as part of our project. It was pretty interesting. I'm sorry Temple left. We brought a bunch of stakeholders together to talk about where they saw egg production going in 20 years. We had people from animal welfare organizations, environmental organizations, consumer organizations, scientists, egg producers, and we were supposed to meet for a day and a half in Washington, D.C., and we got caught in that big blizzard that Washington, D.C. had, and we got stuck together for 4 days. We got to know each other very well. And one evening, we took a big case of wine up to one of the rooms, and we watched the Temple Grandin documentary on HBO. We had a great time. So Anyway, this led to the formation of this project that I've been involved with for the last few years called the Coalition for a Sustainable Egg Supply. It's another multi-stakeholder organization, and we have actually been conducting commercial scale research to generate the data that will allow food system stakeholders to make informed, independent decisions. So our goal is to figure out the trade-offs, the red, yellow, green stoplight in these different kinds of hen production systems. Again, the study is being led by Michigan State and UC Davis, and we're doing it with cooperative agreements and research grants in excess of $6 million. Just to give you a brief feeling for how this project is structured, the leadership group is Michigan State and UC Davis, as well as Cargill, McDonald's, the American Humane Association, and the Center for Food Integrity. And we also have advisors, the Environmental Defense Fund, the USDA, and the American Veterinary Medical Association. And we have a huge group of coalition members participating in this project, ranging from suppliers to retailers to egg farmers, and about a few months after we started it, the Canadian egg producer organizations came in as well, because that train is heading into Canada, and they know it, and they want to get this data prior to decision making. We have 3 different types of hen housing systems. There were actually commercial facilities built for this research project, and we are looking at environmental impact, food safety, worker safety, animal health and well-being, and food affordability over 2 flock cycles. And we have those data, and I won't have time to talk about them today, but it's quite interesting. So in terms of the future of the egg industry, where are things going from here? I think somebody said earlier, maybe David, talking about the swine industry, that really that discussion is over. I think gestation stalls are gone, and I think conventional cages are also gone in the United States. The question is, what are we going to replace them with? That's the big issue right now. And that, I see, creates some R&D challenges for the egg industry. So first of all, what we're finding is that some old problems that we got rid of when we put hens in cages are coming back. Some of the problems with parasites, disease, hen mortality, those are problems in some of these more extensive systems. So in Europe, for example, poultry red mite is now epidemic. Poultry red mite comes about because the mites live off the hens during the day on perches, in the litter, in the nest boxes, and then they infest the hens at night, and they can cause mortality of up to 25%. And they develop very fast resistance to pesticides. To me, I think it would be sort of easy to wave our hands and say, okay, well then we can't have these systems. I think what we have to think about is, can we mitigate? Do we need to put our hats on and think about a different way to approach these systems? And if so, what are the costs going to be of mitigation? In these new systems, like these furnished cage systems, we have all sorts of new questions. Okay, so we have perches and we have nests. How much nest space? How much perch space? What should the perches be made out of? How are we going to manage these things? How many tiers high can they be? There's a whole, for any of you out there who are students, you've got a research agenda for life, trying to figure out this system. And genetics. We have hens that have been exquisitely selected to live in groups of 6 in conventional cages. Now, all of a sudden, they have all kinds of challenges, right? They have to live in big groups. They have to learn how to traverse perches. They have to learn how to go outside. So we have to figure out both the genetic and environmental components of those features. And sustainability overall. Which of these systems is going to be most sustainable in terms of its environmental impact and how acceptable to stakeholders? So I can tell you this system has a lot of advantages from the hen health perspective, the environmental perspective, but we don't really know if consumers are going to accept this or not. We have to know that. So where I think we're going in the future is because of these consumer demand issues, I think we're going to see a much greater diversity of production systems in the egg industry. We're going to see that same kind of branching out we've had in Europe, where the producers are putting part of their operation into cage-free, part of their operation into enriched cages, etc. And I think that's also creating expanding niches for small and mid-scale producers. We're really seeing this in California now, where we have a lot of smaller scale producers moving into these niche markets where consumers don't mind spending a lot for their eggs, and they want them produced in a particular kind of way. And I think we're also going to see some pretty innovative new systems. I'll just show you one that's been developed in Holland. It's called the Rondeal system. And it's, if I can explain this system, there is actually a conventional aviary right in the center of this that the hens go into at night, and every one of these pie-shaped wedges is a range that the birds can be out on during the day, but it's actually completely enclosed. It's a totally indoor system. So even though you're seeing the birds on the range here, you can see they're enclosed, and that protects them from predators. And you can even make this astroturf if you want to be able to clean it. One of the really interesting features about this system is this area 4. This is actually an area that you can bring the public into. They don't have to go past the hens, so they don't need any biosecurity precautions. And they can stand up here in this tower and they can actually look at the hens in the aviary and in the outside system. So this was set up really as a public educational effort. So I think the egg industry is going to continue to experience a lot of pressures that they're going to have to resolve, whether those are coming from the consumers that are purchasing their products directly, from the retailers. I just picked McDonald's as an example, but I could have put up the same list that David put up earlier, from legal pressures, and something we haven't talked about too much here, from global issues. So there's not a lot of global trade in eggs right now, but about 30% of eggs are liquid or powdered. So there's certainly a potential for global trade, and we have to think about China, for example, producing cheaper eggs according to different standards, and how that's going to affect the U.S. egg industry. I think another important thing that's maybe a little unique to poultry is that chickens are on the move from being food animals to being something else, because of the explosion, I don't know if you have it here, of backyard poultry keeping. When I get home, I am going to have a voicemail full of, Dr. Mench, I saw your name on the web and my chicken. Where do I find? How do I do backyard poultry keeping? I have a student who just did a survey of backyard poultry keepers, and we got some really interesting results about what they think about things. So why do people keep chickens? The big reason is food for home use and as gardening partners to produce manure. But 57% of people consider their chickens to be pets, right? And when they stop laying eggs, they keep them throughout their natural lifespan. So this is a different kind of mindset, right? We also asked them about their views of the commercial industry. And as far as they were concerned, 95% of them thought the health and welfare of their chickens was better than in the commercial industry. 95% thought the eggs and meat tasted better. 85% thought their eggs and meat were more nutritious. And 82% thought that their food was safer than the food produced by the commercial industry. So this is a sort of interesting divide that we've got to address. And we've talked about this today, and I really see this as a big challenge for all of us down the road, is trying to communicate with the public to see what their values, attitudes, and views are. As part of our Coalition for a Sustainable Egg Supply project, the Center for Food Integrity is actually taking our research results and going out and setting up focus groups and saying, okay, what do you think about egg production systems? This is what the researchers found. How does this influence your views? And they're asking about the things that really resonate with consumers. What pieces of information influence them? And some of them are a little surprising. I can tell you one of the results they had on all of their focus groups was all of the focus groups came in preferring cage-free eggs. They all said they bought them, even though most of them didn't, but in their minds, they bought cage-free eggs. one of the most influential pieces of information in changing their mind was the higher mortality in cage-free systems. That was very important to them. They said, you know, I like it that the hens can run around, but if they're not healthy, that's not good. I would rather have a more restrictive system if it preserved hen health. So I don't think we know a lot about the language that resonates with people. So in closing, I'd just like to say that this piece of it is a two-way street. It's not really just about educating the public. It's about understanding that the public may have some very deeply held values and that we have to understand and reflect those in the things we do. The good piece of news, even though the information that was shown earlier that people rarely get their information from university scientists, one thing that our research has shown is that when they do get information from university scientists, when that's made available to them, university scientists are highly respected as sources of information. People really do value scientific information. So for all of us here who are in the academic environment, I think that's an important thing we need to think about is how we get our information out into that public venue. So I'll take any questions if we have time.
Yeah. In the states that have outlawed cages, does that also apply to hatcheries?
No. It's only adult laying hens. So, yeah, and the big provision in all those laws that none of them actually say you can't have cages. What they say is that the hens, this is a little funny, so when I do it, you can all laugh. What it says is that the hens have to be able to spread both wings without touching the sides of an enclosure or another hen. Since they don't do that, it makes it a little hard to understand what it means, but the gist of it is a sufficient amount of space that really you couldn't, a conventional cage, you could only have one hen in it. So, got questions up?
In the back?
Okay. So Prop 2 does not cover imports of eggs at all. What happened was the state of California passed a law saying that all eggs coming into the state, it's a totally separate law, have to meet the Prop 2 requirements. Now, one of the difficult things about it is the Humane Society put Proposition 2 on the ballot, and they specifically worded it so that it cannot be regulated. So we have no regulations. So as of 2015, we will basically only import eggs that meet regulatory standards that we don't have under Proposition 2, because it can't be regulated. It's a very complicated legal situation. I think the state of California is going to be tied up in litigation for forever and a day over this proposition and its follow-up effects. So,
Right.
In this area, Arkansas, Missouri, there's been a huge influx of new egg farms built.
mm-hmm.
Most of those eggs are going to California. So what has been the impact of California economically? Do you have a handle on that?
So as of 2008, we already imported 50% of our eggs. And I think that's changed a little bit. It's increased a little bit. The effective date of Prop 2 is not until January. So then we'll really see what happens, because the day the law, the other law, which is AB 1437, comes into effect that we're going to restrict imports, that's the day that's going to launch all the legal activity to see whether that's going to stand or fall. So, so we just don't know. Right now, my sense is that most of our egg producers are hanging in, staying in the state. They've probably diverged a bit, so they put more of their production into cage-free, assuming that they might have more local market there.
Are they letting build more houses?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Can they build enriched cages?
Yes.
Okay.
That's what, in fact, my understanding is that in the last 4 years or 5 years, no U.S. producer has put in conventional cages. They're all going enriched although not necessarily with the enrichments in them. So just larger cages.